The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the Phoenix Metropolitan Police Training Academy as 37 elite officers lined up for what would become the most humbling lesson in tactical operations any of them had ever witnessed. Among the sea of tactical gear, military-style haircuts, and intimidating physiques stood a figure so unremarkable that most of the recruits hadn't even noticed her arrival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Natasha Kellerman wore simple civilian clothes, faded blue jeans, worn sneakers, and a plain black t-shirt that hung loosely on her slight frame. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose gave her the appearance of a librarian who had wandered into the wrong building. What none of these hardened law enforcement professionals could have imagined was that this unassuming woman would soon demonstrate breach techniques so advanced that they would revolutionize tactical training across the entire Southwest, expose a deadly conspiracy that had cost officers their lives, and prove that the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people based on their appearance. The Phoenix Metropolitan Police Training Academy buzzed with the controlled energy of law enforcement's finest preparing for specialized operations training. Located in the sprawling desert just outside Scottsdale, the facility represented the pinnacle of tactical education, where seasoned officers came to master the skills that could mean the difference between life and death in high-stakes situations. The morning air already shimmered with heat despite the early hour, and the distant mountains provided a stark backdrop to what everyone expected would be another routine advanced training session. Officer Luis Morales had been manning the security checkpoint for nearly 5 years, and his experienced eye could categorize visitors within seconds of their approach. Attorneys arrived in expensive suits with briefcases full of legal documents. Federal agents displayed their credentials with practiced authority. Family members of recruits typically showed obvious nervousness about being on a law enforcement facility. But as Natasha Kellerman approached his station with a worn canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder, Morales found himself genuinely puzzled about her purpose. Her identification listed her as a private security consultant, though nothing about her appearance suggested involvement in law enforcement or military operations. The address showed a modest apartment complex in downtown Phoenix, and her vehicle was a dusty Honda Civic that looked like it had seen better years. When she spoke, requesting access for tactical training observation, her voice carried a quiet confidence that seemed oddly disconnected from her unremarkable appearance. "Ma'am, I show you're scheduled for civilian contractor access," Morales said, while reviewing his computer screen with growing confusion. "The system indicates you're here to observe SWAT training operations, but I don't see any federal agency authorization or law enforcement credentials. Are you sure you have the right facility?" Natasha adjusted her glasses with a slight smile that suggested she was accustomed to such confusion. "Officer Morales, I believe you'll find my authorization came through Captain Holbrook's office yesterday evening. I'm here to provide technical consultation on tactical entry procedures for the Advanced Operations course." The explanation seemed reasonable enough, though Morales couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't quite add up. Private security consultants usually arrived with obvious military backgrounds, tactical gear, and the kind of confident bearing that advertised their expertise. This woman looked like she could be teaching middle school mathematics, rather than advising elite law enforcement officers on dangerous operations. After verifying her visitor authorization and providing a temporary access badge, Morales watched Natasha walk toward the main training complex with steps that appeared unhurried, but covered ground with surprising efficiency. Her messenger bag bounced slightly against her hip, and nothing about her movements suggested the athletic conditioning typically associated with tactical operations specialists. The Advanced Tactical Operations Center occupied the newest section of the Academy complex, featuring state-of-the-art simulation facilities that replicated everything from residential homes to commercial buildings. The centerpiece was a 3-story urban warfare training structure known as the Maze, complete with multiple entry points, hidden passages, and sophisticated electronic monitoring systems that recorded every aspect of training scenarios. Instructor Blake Garrison had been running tactical training programs for over 15 years, and his reputation for producing exceptional SWAT operators was known throughout law enforcement circles. His background included military special operations, federal law enforcement, and private security contracting in overseas conflict zones. When recruits first encountered his intense stare and commanding presence, They understood immediately that their training would be conducted by someone who had faced real danger in life-or-death situations. The morning briefing was scheduled to begin at precisely 700 hours, and Garrison prided himself on punctuality that reflected military precision. As the 37 advanced training candidates assembled in the main classroom, their gear and bearing announced their credentials. Most were experienced SWAT team members from departments across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. Several displayed combat ribbons indicating military service in active conflict zones. All carried themselves with the confident posture of professionals who had proven their capabilities under pressure. When Natasha quietly entered the back of the classroom and took a seat in the last row, the reaction was immediate and predictable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as hardened tactical officers tried to process why someone who looked like a substitute teacher was attending their advanced operations briefing. Several exchanged glances that mixed confusion with barely concealed amusement, while others simply stared with expressions suggesting they were witnessing something completely unprecedented. Garrison's reaction was more direct and significantly less diplomatic. His years of military service had instilled a protective instinct regarding training security, and the presence of an obvious civilian in his classified briefing triggered immediate alarm bells. His voice carried the sharp edge of authority when he addressed what he perceived as a serious security breach. "Ma'am, I believe you're in the wrong location," Garrison announced, his tone making it clear that this was not a request for clarification, but a directive for immediate compliance. This briefing covers classified tactical procedures for sworn law enforcement personnel only. The administrative offices are located in the main building if you need assistance with whatever brought you here. The assumption was logical and completely understandable. Natasha's appearance suggested someone far more likely to be lost than participating in elite tactical training. Her civilian clothes and academic demeanor seemed fundamentally incompatible with an environment where participants routinely handled explosive devices and practiced urban warfare techniques. Natasha remained seated while calmly retrieving a folder from her messenger bag. Her movements were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting someone accustomed to skeptical receptions and bureaucratic challenges. When she spoke, her voice maintained the same quiet confidence that had puzzled Officer Morales at the security checkpoint. "Instructor Garrison, I believe you'll find my authorization in order," she replied while extending official documentation that bore Captain Holbrook's signature and department seal. "I'm here as a technical consultant for tactical entry procedures. My understanding is that recent training incidents have raised questions about current breach methodologies." The paperwork appeared legitimate, though Garrison's military background made him instinctively suspicious of any deviation from established protocols. His review of the authorization documents confirmed that Captain Holbrook had indeed requested civilian consultation, though the reasoning remained unclear to someone who considered his training programs to be among the most effective in the country. The mention of recent training incidents struck a nerve that Garrison worked hard to conceal. 3 officers from different departments had suffered serious injuries during breach training exercises over the past 6 months, and federal investigators had begun asking uncomfortable questions about safety protocols. While the official reports attributed these incidents to trainee error and equipment malfunctions, Garrison knew that more experienced observers might identify patterns that could threaten his career and reputation. Mrs. Garrison paused, realizing he didn't even know the consultant's name, which somehow made her presence seem even more inappropriate. "Kellerman," Natasha supplied helpfully. "And it's Ms., though I prefer Tosh if that's acceptable." The informal nickname somehow made the situation even more surreal. Garrison couldn't remember the last time someone had requested to be addressed by a casual nickname during official tactical training, and the request seemed to epitomize everything wrong with allowing civilian consultants into serious law enforcement operations. "Miss Kellerman," Garrison continued with carefully controlled patience, "I appreciate whatever expertise you might possess, but tactical operations require understanding that comes from actual field experience under dangerous conditions. The procedures we teach here have been developed through decades of real-world application by professionals who have faced armed suspects in life-threatening situations." Several trainees nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting approval of their instructor's protective stance regarding training integrity. The implied message was clear. Whatever qualifications this civilian consultant might claim, she lacked the credibility that came from proven performance in actual tactical operations. Natasha accepted the dismissal with grace that suggested she had encountered similar skepticism before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rather than defending her qualifications or demanding recognition, she simply nodded and indicated her intention to observe quietly without disrupting the training process. "I understand your concerns completely, Instructor Garrison," she replied, with what appeared to be genuine respect for his position. "I'm here merely to observe current techniques and perhaps offer alternative perspectives if appropriate opportunities arise. Please proceed with your normal curriculum." The response was so diplomatic and unassuming that Garrison found his initial hostility softening slightly. Whatever this woman's background, she clearly understood military courtesy and protocol. Her willingness to observe without interference suggested someone who respected the training environment even if her presence remained puzzling. Captain Derek Holbrook arrived at the training facility just as the morning briefing was concluding, his presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. His uniform displayed ribbons and commendations earned through 22 years of exemplary service, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the lives and careers of subordinates. When he entered the classroom, conversations stopped, and postures straightened in automatic response to senior authority. However, Natasha's trained eye immediately noticed details that others missed. Holbrook's expensive watch exceeded what his salary should afford, and his tactical gear showed evidence of recent upgrades that weren't standard department issue. More concerning, his reaction upon seeing her suggested recognition rather than surprise, indicating that her presence was part of a larger plan that hadn't been shared with the training staff. "Instructor Garrison, how are our trainees progressing?" Holbrook asked with the kind of casual authority that suggested routine interest in training operations. His glance toward Natasha appeared cursory, as if her presence was expected but unremarkable. Garrison's response revealed his ongoing discomfort with the civilian consultant's presence, while maintaining appropriate respect for his superior officer. "Sir, we have an exceptional group of candidates this session. Their backgrounds and experience levels suggest they'll respond well to advanced techniques. We do have a civilian consultant observing today, as per your authorization." The mention of authorization caused Holbrook's expression to shift almost imperceptibly, suggesting someone whose carefully laid plans required precise coordination. His acknowledgement of Natasha's presence was brief and seemingly dismissive, though she detected undertones that indicated their interaction was far from coincidental. "Miss Kellerman, I trust you'll find our training procedures educational," Holbrook said with professional courtesy that masked whatever private agenda had brought her to the facility. "Instructor Garrison runs one of the finest tactical programs in the Southwest, and I'm confident you'll see techniques that represent the current state of the art in law enforcement operations." The exchange was polite and apparently routine, though Natasha sensed undercurrents that suggested complex motivations beyond simple training observation. Her years of experience in environments where survival depended on reading subtle cues had taught her to pay attention to details that others might overlook, and everything about this situation felt carefully orchestrated rather than spontaneous. As the trainees prepared to move to the practical training areas, Natasha gathered her belongings with movements that appeared casual but actually represented careful observation of personnel and procedures. Her messenger bag contained equipment that would have surprised anyone who had dismissed her as a harmless civilian consultant, though she was careful to ensure that nothing about her appearance suggested capabilities beyond administrative support. The first practical exercise involved basic door breaching techniques using mechanical tools and controlled explosive charges. The trainees assembled around a mock residential structure that replicated typical urban environments where tactical operations occurred, complete with reinforced doors, security systems, and multiple entry points that required careful coordination between team members. Instructor Garrison began his demonstration with confidence born from years of successful training programs and field experience. His technique represented standard law enforcement doctrine that emphasized overwhelming force and rapid entry designed to disorient suspects while protecting officer safety. The methods were time-tested and had proven effective in thousands of real-world operations. However, as Natasha watched the demonstration from her position in the observation area, her expression grew increasingly concerned. The techniques being taught were fundamentally sound, but contained subtle flaws that could prove dangerous under certain conditions. More troubling, she recognized specific patterns that matched incident reports from recent training accidents that had injured experienced officers. The door frame splintered dramatically as Garrison's team executed their breach, and the trainees responded with obvious approval for the instructor's apparent expertise. The entry was completed in textbook fashion, with team members flowing through the opening in coordinated sequence that demonstrated professional competence and careful preparation. But Natasha had noticed that the explosive charge placement created stress patterns in the surrounding structure that could have caused catastrophic failure if the building materials had been different. The timing sequence used for team entry also created a brief window where officers would be exposed to potentially deadly crossfire from multiple angles. Most concerning, the radio communications during the breach contained gaps that could have prevented coordination with backup units during an actual emergency. These weren't theoretical concerns or academic criticisms. They were specific safety issues that Natasha recognized from her own experience with similar operations conducted under far more dangerous conditions than training exercises. Her background included situations where such subtle mistakes had cost lives, and seeing them incorporated into official training doctrine was deeply troubling. During the break between exercises, several trainees gathered around the refreshment area with conversations that inevitably focused on the unusual presence of a civilian consultant. Their comments ranged from amused speculation about her qualifications to more pointed criticism of department policies that allowed outsiders to observe sensitive training operations. "I don't care what kind of authorization she has," muttered Detective Ray Morgan from the Tucson SWAT team, his voice carrying the frustrated tone of someone whose professional competence felt questioned. "This is specialized law enforcement training, not a community college criminology course. What's next? Bringing in mall security guards to critique our weapons handling." His comment drew laughter from several colleagues who shared his skepticism about civilian involvement in tactical operations. The sentiment was understandable and reflected legitimate concerns about maintaining operational security and training integrity that had been developed through decades of dangerous real-world experience. Officer Janet Reeves from the Phoenix Metropolitan Unit offered a slightly different perspective, though her tone suggested similar reservations about the situation. Maybe she's some kind of federal observer checking up on training standards. You know how the bureaucrats love their oversight programs and compliance reviews. The speculation continued, with variations that ranged from conspiracy theories about federal investigations to humorous suggestions that Natasha might be conducting research for a television documentary about law enforcement training. None of the experienced tactical officers considered the possibility that their unassuming observer might possess expertise that exceeded their own, because nothing about her appearance or demeanor suggested such capabilities. What they couldn't know was that Natasha was conducting her own careful assessment of their capabilities and training methodologies. Her years of experience in situations where tactical errors meant death had given her an eye for subtle problems that could prove catastrophic under actual operational conditions. The more she observed, the more concerned she became about systematic flaws in training doctrine that were being perpetuated through official instruction. The afternoon session focused on advanced breach techniques involving multiple entry points and coordinated team movements through complex structures. The exercises were designed to replicate real-world scenarios where SWAT teams faced armed suspects in fortified positions, requiring precise timing and flawless execution to minimize casualties while achieving tactical objectives. As the training progressed, Natasha began to see patterns that went beyond simple instructional shortcomings. The techniques being taught consistently prioritized speed over safety, creating opportunities for friendly fire incidents and structural collapses that could trap officers in dangerous positions. More troubling, several procedures violated basic principles that she knew were emphasized in federal training programs, suggesting that Captain Holbrook's command was operating under modified doctrines that hadn't been properly tested or approved. Her suspicions deepened when she noticed that the training scenarios were being documented with equipment that transmitted real-time video feeds to locations outside the immediate training area. While such monitoring wasn't unusual in itself, the specific camera angles and communication protocols suggested that the sessions were being recorded for purposes beyond simple performance evaluation. By the end of the first day, Natasha had observed enough to confirm her worst fears about systematic problems in tactical training that extended far beyond simple procedural disagreements. The evidence suggested deliberate modifications to establish safety protocols that increased risks to officers, while potentially benefiting someone who profited from training contracts or equipment sales. But she also knew that her concerns would be dismissed as easily as her expertise had been underestimated. Proving that respected training programs contained deadly flaws would require more than civilian observations and academic credentials. It would require demonstrating capabilities that no one expected from someone who looked like a substitute teacher with a messenger bag full of notebooks. The real test would come when circumstances forced her to choose between maintaining her unassuming cover and preventing the kind of tragedy that had brought her to the Phoenix Metropolitan Police Training Academy in the first place. Because Natasha Kellerman wasn't just a civilian consultant observing tactical training. She was someone whose true background would shock everyone who had dismissed her credentials, and whose skills had been proven in operations that remained classified years after their completion. Tomorrow's training session would provide the opportunity she needed to expose the systematic problems she had identified, but it would also require revealing capabilities that she had worked hard to keep hidden. The question was whether the lives at stake justified the personal costs of abandoning her carefully maintained civilian identity to become the person she had once been before tragedy had forced her into hiding. The second day of training began with an intensity that immediately set it apart from the previous session's routine exercises. The Arizona desert heat was already building despite the early morning hour, and the training facility hummed with preparations for what Instructor Garrison had promised would be the most challenging scenarios the advanced course offered. Natasha arrived at the academy gates wearing the same unremarkable civilian clothes that had marked her as an outsider the day before, but her eyes held a sharpness that suggested someone who had spent the previous evening analyzing everything she had witnessed. Officer Morales barely glanced up as she approached the security checkpoint, having already categorized her as the harmless civilian consultant who seemed perpetually lost among the tactical equipment and military bearing that defined the facility's normal operations. His casual greeting reflected the comfortable familiarity that develops when security personnel encounter the same low-priority visitors repeatedly. "Morning, Miss Kellerman. Back for more observations today?" His tone carried the friendly disinterest of someone making polite conversation while processing routine paperwork. The question was purely rhetorical, as her visitor authorization clearly indicated a multi-day consulting arrangement that required no additional verification. Natasha accepted her temporary badge with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed previously, though her response carried undertones that would have seemed significant to anyone trained to recognize subtle changes in behavioral patterns. "Good morning, Officer Morales. Yes, I expect today will be quite educational for everyone involved." The phrasing was innocuous enough to pass unnoticed by someone focused on standard security procedures, but it contained implications that reflected her growing understanding of the systematic problems embedded within the training program. Her overnight analysis of observation notes had revealed patterns that went far beyond simple instructional shortcomings, pointing toward deliberate modifications of safety protocols that served interests other than officer welfare. The walk to the Advanced Tactical Operations Center took her past maintenance areas where she noticed details that had escaped her attention during the previous day's initial reconnaissance. Equipment serial numbers on explosive charges didn't match department inventory records visible through open storage facility doors. Training ammunition showed manufacturer markings that indicated government surplus sales rather than official law enforcement procurement channels. Most troubling, several pieces of breech equipment displayed modification marks suggesting unauthorized alterations to factory specifications. These observations painted a disturbing picture of training operations that existed partially outside official oversight and accountability structures. Someone was operating with resources and authority that exceeded normal departmental budgets, while maintaining training programs that deviated from established federal guidelines in ways that increased dangers to participating officers. The morning briefing room buzzed with conversations that revealed the competitive atmosphere among elite tactical personnel gathered from across the southwestern United States. These were experienced professionals whose careers had been built on successful completion of dangerous operations under extreme conditions, and their discussions reflected the kind of technical expertise that civilian observers rarely encountered. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Albuquerque Metropolitan Unit was describing a recent hostage rescue operation that had required simultaneous breaches of multiple entry points in a fortified warehouse complex. Her account emphasized split-second timing coordination that had enabled her team to neutralize armed suspects while protecting civilian casualties, demonstrating the kind of real-world application that gave credibility to advanced training programs. The key was recognizing that standard door charges would have alerted the suspects to our primary entry point, Martinez explained to a group of colleagues who understood the tactical implications immediately. We had to modify the explosive placement to create a diversion breach that drew their attention away from our actual assault route, saved 3 hostages who would have been executed the moment they realized we were coming through the main entrance. Her story illustrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking and technical expertise that advanced tactical training was designed to develop. The ability to adapt standard procedures to unique operational requirements represented the difference between routine law enforcement activities and the specialized capabilities that SWAT teams provided during crisis situations. Sergeant Michael Torres from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police contributed his own account of a barricaded suspect scenario that had required creative breach techniques when conventional approaches proved inadequate. His experience involved a mentally disturbed individual who had fortified his apartment with improvised explosive devices that made standard entry procedures potentially suicidal for responding officers. We ended up using a combination of mechanical and explosive breaches that created confusion about our actual entry point, Torres continued. The suspect was monitoring our radio communications and had prepared countermeasures for every standard technique in our playbook. Success required improvisation that went beyond anything we had practiced during training scenarios. These conversations provided Natasha with valuable insights into the real-world challenges that tactical teams faced during actual operations, while simultaneously highlighting the gap between training doctrine and field requirements that she had begun to identify. The officer's accounts consistently involved situations where creative modifications of standard procedures had been necessary for mission success, yet the training program she was observing seemed to discourage exactly the kind of innovative thinking that these veterans described. Instructor Garrison entered the briefing room with his characteristic military bearing, immediately commanding attention from the assembled trainees who understood that their morning education was about to begin. His presence carried the authority of someone whose expertise had been proven through years of successful training programs and field operations, though Natasha noticed subtle indicators that suggested recent stress and defensive attitudes that hadn't been present during previous sessions. Today's exercises will focus on complex structural breaches involving reinforced barriers and multiple defensive positions, Garrison announced with the confidence that had established his reputation as one of the Southwest's premier tactical instructors. You'll be working with explosive charges and mechanical tools under time constraints that replicate actual operational pressures. The description promised exactly the kind of advanced training that experienced SWAT personnel required to maintain their edge in an increasingly dangerous operational environment. However, Natasha's review of the planned scenarios had revealed exercise designs that contained the same systematic flaws she had identified during the previous day's observations, amplified by increased complexity and higher stakes that made potential failures even more dangerous. As the trainees prepared to move to the practical training areas, Natasha positioned herself to observe the equipment preparation process that preceded actual breach exercises. Her background in explosive ordnance disposal had given her expertise in recognizing subtle indicators of improper procedures that could result in catastrophic equipment failures, and what she witnessed during the setup process confirmed her worst fears about training safety protocols. The explosive charges being prepared for the morning exercises showed clear evidence of modifications that exceeded manufacturer specifications for law enforcement applications. Detonation timing mechanisms had been altered to produce faster energy release that would create more dramatic training effects while potentially exceeding structural safety margins that prevented building collapse or personnel injury from excessive blast pressure. More concerning, this setup procedures being followed by training support personnel violated basic safety protocols that were considered fundamental in any legitimate explosive ordnance program. Safety distances weren't being maintained during charge preparation, protective equipment was being used inconsistently, and quality control checks that should have preceded every exercise were being abbreviated or skipped entirely. These weren't minor procedural variations or acceptable shortcuts designed to accommodate training schedules. They represented systematic negligence that created unacceptable risks to everyone involved in the training program, from instructors and trainees to support personnel and civilian observers who might be present during exercises. Specialist Rachel Park, a young officer from the Phoenix Metropolitan Department, approached Natasha during the equipment preparation phase with the kind of professional curiosity that marked promising law enforcement personnel. Her questions suggested someone whose instincts had detected anomalies that more experienced officers had either missed or chosen to ignore. "Ms. Kellerman, I noticed you've been paying close attention to the equipment setup procedures," Park observed with careful diplomacy that avoided direct criticism of training operations while expressing legitimate concerns. "In your consulting experience, have you encountered variations in explosive charge preparation that might affect training outcomes?" The question was professionally phrased and technically appropriate, though it contained implications that revealed Park's growing unease about aspects of the training program that didn't align with her previous educational experiences. Her background included federal law enforcement training that emphasized safety protocols as fundamental requirements rather than optional guidelines. Natasha recognized the opportunity to begin planting seeds of awareness among the more observant trainees without directly challenging the training authority structure that would dismiss her concerns if presented too openly. Her response was carefully calibrated to encourage Park's professional instincts while avoiding confrontational statements that might trigger defensive reactions. "Specialist Park, explosive ordnance procedures can vary significantly between different applications and operational environments," she replied with the diplomatic neutrality that had characterized all her previous interactions with training personnel. "The techniques appropriate for military combat operations sometimes differ from those used in civilian law enforcement contexts, particularly regarding safety margins and collateral damage considerations." The answer was technically accurate while containing subtle warnings that someone with Park's training background would recognize as significant. The distinction between military and civilian applications was fundamental to proper tactical training, and any blurring of those boundaries represented potential safety hazards that responsible instructors should address directly rather than ignore. Park's expression indicated that she understood the implications of Natasha's diplomatically phrased concerns, though her position as a junior officer in an advanced training program made it difficult for her to raise questions that might be interpreted as challenges to instructor expertise. The dynamics of military-style training hierarchies discouraged exactly the kind of critical thinking that could identify and correct systematic problems before they resulted in casualties. The first complex breach exercise took place in a specially constructed training facility that replicated a multi-story urban building complete with reinforced doors, barricaded windows, and defensive positions that tactical teams encountered during actual operations. The structure represented significant investment in realistic training environments, though Natasha's examination revealed construction shortcuts that compromised structural integrity in ways that could prove dangerous during high-energy breach operations. Captain Holbrook arrived at the training site just as the morning exercises were beginning, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in ways that suggested his involvement went beyond routine supervisory oversight. His interactions with Instructor Garrison carried undertones of coordination that implied shared knowledge of agenda items that hadn't been communicated to the participating trainees or civilian observers. "Instructor Garrison, I trust today's scenarios will provide appropriate challenges for our advanced candidates," Holbrook stated with authority that left no doubt about his expectations for training outcomes. His glance toward the assembled officers suggested someone evaluating personnel for purposes beyond simple skill development. Garrison's response reflected the kind of subordinate deference that characterized military-style organizational structures, though Natasha detected stress indicators that suggested someone operating under pressures that exceeded normal training program requirements. "Sir, today's exercises represent the most comprehensive tactical scenarios we've developed. The candidates will face situations that test every aspect of their breach and entry capabilities." The exchange appeared routine to casual observers, but Natasha's experience in organizational environments where hidden agendas shaped operational decisions enabled her to recognize coordination patterns that suggested more complex motivations than simple training program administration. Both officers were clearly working toward objectives that hadn't been shared with the trainees or documented in official program materials. As the first team prepared to execute their breach sequence, Natasha positioned herself to observe both the tactical execution and the monitoring procedures being used to document training outcomes. Her background in classified operations had taught her to pay attention to information collection activities that might indicate purposes beyond immediate training requirements. The breach execution proceeded with textbook precision as the lead team approached their target entry point with coordinated movements that demonstrated professional competence and careful preparation. Their radio communications maintained proper protocol, while tactical positioning showed understanding of safety principles that protected team members from potential hostile fire during the vulnerable entry phase. However, the explosive charge detonation produced effects that immediately alarmed Natasha's trained eye. The blast pressure exceeded normal parameters for law enforcement applications while creating structural stress patterns that threatened building integrity in ways that could have caused catastrophic collapse if the training facility hadn't been specifically designed to absorb such punishment. More troubling, the entry sequence that followed the breach created exposure periods where team members were silhouetted against the entry point in ways that would have made them vulnerable to defensive fire from multiple angles during actual operations. The techniques being taught prioritized speed over tactical awareness, potentially creating casualty situations that experienced officers would normally avoid through more careful approach procedures. Detective Martinez, whose experience in actual hostage rescue operations provided her with realistic performance standards, approached Natasha during the post-exercise debriefing with questions that revealed her own concerns about what she had witnessed during the breach demonstration. Her inquiry was professionally phrased, but contained implications that suggested growing unease about training methodologies that differed from her field experience. Ms. Kellerman, the blast effects seemed more intense than what we typically use in actual operations, Martinez observed with careful neutrality that avoided direct criticism while expressing legitimate technical concerns. In your consulting experience, have you encountered training programs that use higher energy charges than field applications normally require? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of professional awareness that Natasha had been hoping to encounter among the more experienced trainees. Martinez's field experience provided her with realistic baseline standards that enabled her to recognize when training scenarios exceeded normal operational parameters in potentially dangerous ways. Natasha's response was designed to validate Martinez's professional instincts while encouraging further critical evaluation of training procedures that deviated from established best practices. Detective Martinez, training realism often requires balancing educational effectiveness with safety considerations that don't apply during actual operations. However, preparation for field conditions should maintain appropriate relationships between training scenarios and real-world applications. The diplomatically phrased answer contained sufficient technical implications to confirm Martinez's suspicions while avoiding direct accusations that could be interpreted as inappropriate civilian interference in law enforcement training operations. The message was clear to someone with Martinez's experience. The training procedures being demonstrated contained elements that exceeded normal operational requirements in ways that created unnecessary risks. During the lunch break, Natasha took advantage of unsupervised access to training support areas to conduct more detailed examination of equipment and documentation that might provide evidence of the systematic problems she had been identifying. Her background in intelligence analysis had taught her to recognize administrative patterns that revealed operational inconsistencies and procedural violations that might not be apparent through casual observation. The equipment's storage facilities contained explosive ordnance that displayed manufacturer markings, indicating sources that fell outside normal law enforcement procurement channels. Training ammunition showed lot numbers that traced to military surplus sales rather than departmental purchasing records. Most concerning, several breach charges showed modification marks that suggested unauthorized alterations to factory specifications that could create unpredictable performance characteristics during actual use. These discoveries provided concrete evidence that the training program was operating with resources and procedures that existed partially outside official oversight structures. Someone was acquiring materials and implementing techniques that deviated from established protocols in ways that served interests other than legitimate training requirements or officer safety concerns. The documentation review revealed even more disturbing patterns of administrative manipulation that suggested deliberate concealment of training incidents and safety violations that should have triggered immediate investigation by higher authorities. Accident reports had been modified to minimize the apparent severity of personnel injuries that occurred during training exercises. Equipment failure incidents were being attributed to trainee error rather than procedural deficiencies or material defects that might indicate systematic problems. Most damaging, she discovered copies of correspondence between Captain Holbrook and private contractors that referenced financial arrangements for training services and equipment procurement that appeared to exceed his official authority while potentially creating conflicts of interest that violated department ethics regulations. The communication pattern suggested ongoing relationships that benefited participants financially while potentially compromising training quality and safety standards. By the afternoon session, Natasha had assembled sufficient evidence to confirm that the problems she had observed represented deliberate corruption rather than simple procedural inadequacies or resource limitations. The training program was being manipulated to serve private interests while exposing participating officers to unnecessary dangers that increased injury risks and potentially compromised their preparation for actual operational requirements. However, she also understood that presenting such accusations would require credibility that her civilian consultant status couldn't provide. Proving that respected training programs contain systematic corruption would require demonstrating expertise that exceeded the qualifications of established instructors while providing evidence that couldn't be dismissed as civilian misunderstanding of complex tactical procedures. The final exercise of the day involved coordinated multi-team breaches that required precise timing and flawless communication between separate tactical units operating in different areas of the training facility simultaneously. This scenario was designed to replicate large-scale operations where multiple entry points had to be secured simultaneously to prevent suspect escape or hostage endangerment during complex tactical situations. As the exercise preparation proceeded, Natasha recognized that the combination of procedural flaws she had identified throughout the day created a convergence of risk factors that could result in catastrophic training accidents during the complex coordination requirements of multi-team operations. The modified explosive charges, abbreviated safety protocols, and inadequate communication procedures represented individual problems that became exponentially more dangerous when combined during high-stress tactical scenarios. The afternoon's events would provide the catalyst that forced her to choose between maintaining her unassuming civilian identity and preventing the kind of preventable tragedy that had originally brought her to the Phoenix Metropolitan Police Training Academy. Because tomorrow's training session would involve even more complex scenarios with higher stakes, and the systematic problems she had uncovered were building toward a crisis that could cost lives if not addressed immediately. But stopping that crisis would require revealing capabilities and knowledge that would shock everyone who had dismissed her as a harmless civilian consultant with academic credentials rather than operational experience. The question was whether preventing potential tragedy justified the personal costs of abandoning the carefully maintained cover identity that had protected her from the consequences of her previous life in classified operations that officially had never existed. The third morning brought an urgency to the Phoenix Metropolitan Police Training Academy that transformed the atmosphere from routine instruction to emergency response preparation. Word had spread throughout the law enforcement community that a maximum security federal prisoner transport had been compromised during an interstate transfer, resulting in 3 armed federal fugitives barricading themselves in an abandoned industrial complex just 40 miles from the training facility. The situation required immediate deployment of every available tactical resource in the region, including the advanced training candidates who represented the most experienced SWAT personnel from across the Southwest. Emergency vehicles filled the academy parking areas as federal marshals, regional SWAT commanders, and crisis negotiation specialists converged on what had become an impromptu command center for coordinating the largest tactical operation in Arizona's recent history. The industrial complex where the fugitives had taken refuge contained multiple buildings, underground tunnels, and structural modifications that made conventional assault techniques extremely dangerous, while providing numerous escape routes that could enable the suspects to evade capture indefinitely. Natasha arrived at the academy gates to find security procedures transformed from routine visitor processing to wartime access controls that reflected the gravity of the developing situation. Officer Morales barely recognized her amid the chaos of federal vehicles and emergency personnel streaming through checkpoints that had been reinforced with additional security measures designed to protect operational planning from potential intelligence gathering by hostile observers. Ms. Kellerman, I'm not sure civilian consultants are going to be permitted in the facility today, Morales explained with obvious stress as he processed identification for personnel whose authority exceeded anything he normally encountered. This has become a federal law enforcement operation with security classifications that might restrict access for anyone without active operational roles. The explanation was reasonable and completely understandable given the circumstances, though Natasha understood that the developing crisis represented exactly the kind of situation where her expertise might prove crucial for preventing the systematic training failures she had identified from resulting in officer casualties during actual combat operations. Her response carried subtle authority that suggested familiarity with emergency procedures that exceeded civilian consulting experience. Officer Morales, I believe you'll find that my consulting authorization includes provisions for emergency operational support, she replied. while producing documentation that bore federal agency seals indicating security clearances that extended beyond routine training observation. Captain Holbrook specifically requested my presence during any crisis situations that might arise during my consulting period. The additional credentials appeared legitimate and carried authorization levels that exceeded Morales' ability to verify independently, forcing him to defer to senior authority figures who were already overwhelmed with coordinating federal response requirements. Her temporary access badge was upgraded to include emergency operational areas that normally remained restricted to sworn law enforcement personnel with active tactical assignments. The command center had been established in the Academy's largest conference facility, where federal agents and regional commanders were coordinating assault plans using architectural blueprints, satellite imagery, and intelligence reports that painted a complex picture of the challenges facing tactical teams. The fugitives had selected their defensive position with obvious tactical knowledge, choosing a location that maximized their defensive advantages while creating multiple complications for any law enforcement response. Special Agent Patricia Wells from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Crisis Response Team served as the operational commander for what had officially become a federal anti-terrorism operation due to the suspect's previous convictions for domestic terrorism and weapons trafficking. Her briefing to the assembled tactical personnel emphasized the extraordinary dangers presented by fugitives who possess both the training and equipment necessary to inflict massive casualties on responding law enforcement units. Intelligence indicates that the suspects have access to military-grade explosive devices and automatic weapons that were stolen during their escape, Wells announced to the gathered commanders whose tactical experience had prepared them for dangerous operations but rarely at this scale or complexity. They've had 12 hours to prepare defensive positions in a facility that offers numerous advantages for sustained resistance against conventional assault techniques. The situation descriptions sent visible tension through the assembled personnel who understood that successful resolution would require tactical capabilities that exceeded normal SWAT operation parameters. The combination of well-armed suspects, fortified positions, and complex terrain created conditions that could result in extended siege warfare, with potential casualties that might exceed anything in recent law enforcement history. Captain Holbrook stepped forward with the kind of confident authority that had established his reputation as one of the region's premier tactical coordinators, though Natasha noticed stress indicators that suggested someone whose carefully maintained professional image was being tested by circumstances that exceeded his actual capabilities and experience. Agent Wells, my advanced training candidates represent the most experienced tactical personnel available in the Southwest, Holbrook announced with conviction that masked his growing awareness that the developing situation might expose weaknesses in training programs that he had been working to conceal. They've completed intensive breach and entry training that specifically prepares them for exactly this type of complex structural assault operation. His confident assessment drew nods of agreement from federal commanders, who were relieved to learn that experienced tactical personnel were immediately available for operations that might otherwise require waiting for specialized federal units that could take hours to deploy from distant locations. The availability of trained local resources represented a crucial advantage in situations where delayed response could enable suspects to escape or inflict additional casualties. However, Natasha's knowledge of the systematic training deficiencies that she had been documenting made Holbrook's confident claims deeply troubling rather than reassuring. The techniques that had been taught during the advanced training program contained exactly the kinds of procedural flaws that could prove catastrophic during actual combat operations against well-prepared adversaries who possessed military-level equipment and defensive capabilities. Agent Wells began outlining assault scenarios that would require coordinated breaches of multiple entry points simultaneously, creating the kind of complex tactical coordination that distinguished elite law enforcement operations from routine police activities. The industrial complex contained reinforced structures that would require explosive charges significantly more powerful than those used in normal training exercises, while the presence of armed resistance meant that any tactical errors could result in immediate casualties. The primary challenge involves neutralizing defensive positions that command overlapping fields of fire across all conventional approach routes. Wells continued while indicating positions on architectural drawings that showed the tactical complexity facing assault teams. Success will require simultaneous breaches that prevent the suspects from concentrating their defensive fire against individual entry points. The tactical analysis was thorough and professional, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that federal crisis response teams brought to complex operations. However, the assault techniques being discussed would require exactly the kinds of advanced breach capabilities that the Academy's training program claimed to provide, but which Natasha knew contained dangerous procedural deficiencies that could prove fatal under actual combat conditions. Major Jennifer Hayes from the Arizona National Guard's Special Operations Unit raised tactical concerns that reflected military experience with similar complex assault scenarios in overseas combat environments. Her questions focused on coordination procedures and communication protocols that would be essential for preventing friendly fire casualties during multi-team operations conducted under high-stress conditions. Agent Wells: the coordination requirements for simultaneous multi-point breaches create significant risks for fratricide incidents if communication protocols aren't flawlessly executed. Hayes observed with authority that reflected combat experience in situations where tactical coordination errors had resulted in preventable casualties. Have the local tactical teams trained extensively in the kind of complex communication procedures that these scenarios require? The question struck directly at one of the systematic weaknesses that Natasha had identified during her investigation of academy training programs. The communication procedures being taught to advanced candidates contained gaps and inconsistencies that could prove catastrophic during actual operations, where split-second coordination determined the difference between mission success and disaster. Instructor Garrison responded with the kind of defensive confidence that had characterized his approach to previous challenges to his training programs, though his answer revealed lack of actual experience with the kind of complex operations that the developing crisis would require from tactical personnel under his supervision. Major Hayes: our communication protocols represent current law enforcement best practices that have been proven effective during numerous successful operations. Garrison replied with authority that masked his growing awareness that federal scrutiny might expose training deficiencies that he had been working to conceal. The candidates have completed extensive training in coordinated tactical communications that specifically prepares them for multi-team operations. His confident assessment was technically accurate according to official training documentation, but Natasha knew that the actual instruction had abbreviated critical safety procedures while emphasizing techniques that prioritize speed over coordination accuracy. The resulting communication gaps could prove fatal during operations where precise timing was essential for preventing casualties from both hostile fire and friendly fire incidents. Agent Wells continued her operational briefing with tactical assignments that would require the most experienced personnel available to execute complex breach sequences under conditions that left no margin for procedural errors or equipment failures. The stakes were clear. Failure to neutralize the fugitives quickly could result in their escape and continued threat to public safety, while tactical errors during the assault could cost the lives of law enforcement personnel whose families were counting on their safe return. Team Alpha will execute the primary breach on the east entrance while Team Bravo simultaneously breaches the north access point, Wells announced while indicating positions that required precise timing coordination between units that would be operating without visual contact during critical phases of the operation. Team Charlie will provide overwatch and backup breach capability if primary assault routes encounter unexpected resistance. The tactical plan was comprehensive and reflected professional competence in coordinating complex operations, though its success would depend entirely on the technical capabilities of participating personnel who had been trained using the deficient procedures that Natasha had been documenting. Her knowledge of systematic training failures made her increasingly alarmed about the potential for preventable casualties during an operation that already carried extraordinary inherent risks. Detective Martinez from the Albuquerque Metropolitan Unit volunteered for Team Alpha's primary assault role with the kind of aggressive leadership that had distinguished her career in tactical operations. Her experience included successful completion of similar high-risk operations, though none had involved the combination of well-armed resistance and complex structural challenges that characterized the current situation. Agent Wells: Team Alpha can handle the primary breach assignment, Martinez announced with confidence that reflected professional competence and willingness to accept responsibility for the most dangerous aspects of the planned operation. We have the experience and equipment necessary to neutralize defensive positions while creating entry opportunities for follow-on teams. Her willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous assignment demonstrated exactly the kind of professional courage that characterized elite law enforcement personnel, though Natasha understood that Martinez's confidence was based on training that contained systematic deficiencies that could prove fatal during actual combat operations against prepared adversaries. Sergeant Torres from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police similarly volunteered for Team Bravo's coordinated breach assignment, displaying the aggressive professional attitude that had earned him recognition as one of the Southwest's most capable tactical team leaders. His background included successful operations in urban environments, similar to the industrial complex where the fugitives had established their defensive positions. Agent Wells' Team Bravo is ready to execute simultaneous breach operations with whatever coordination requirements the tactical plan specifies, Torres stated with authority that reflected years of successful operations under dangerous conditions. We understand the timing requirements and communication protocols necessary for coordinated multi-team assault scenarios. The volunteers represented the most experienced tactical personnel available for the operation, though their confidence was based on training that Natasha knew contained exactly the kinds of procedural flaws that could prove catastrophic during the complex coordination requirements that successful resolution would demand. As the operational planning proceeded, Natasha found herself in an increasingly difficult position regarding the systematic problems she had identified during her investigation of academy training programs. Her evidence clearly indicated that participating personnel had been trained using techniques that contained dangerous deficiencies. Yet her civilian consultant status provided no credible platform for raising concerns that would inevitably be dismissed as inappropriate interference by someone lacking operational experience. The tactical briefing continued with equipment assignments and communication protocol reviews that revealed additional areas where training deficiencies could prove problematic during actual operations. The explosive charges being prepared for structural breaches showed the same modification patterns that Natasha had identified as potentially dangerous, while communication procedures contained the same coordination gaps that could result in friendly fire incidents during high-stress tactical situations. Agent Wells concluded her briefing with timeline requirements that emphasized the urgency of mounting an immediate assault before the fugitives could either escape through tunnel systems or prepare additional defensive measures that might make the facility virtually impregnable against conventional law enforcement techniques. Operational timeline requires assault initiation within 4 hours to prevent suspect escape and minimize risks to public safety, Wells announced while reviewing synchronization requirements that would challenge even the most experienced tactical personnel. All teams must be prepared for immediate deployment with full understanding that this operation represents maximum risk conditions for all participating personnel. The timeline created additional pressure that would test tactical capabilities under exactly the kinds of stress conditions where procedural deficiencies became most dangerous. Natasha understood that the combination of time pressure, complex coordination requirements, and well-armed resistance created perfect conditions for the systematic training failure she had documented to result in preventable law enforcement casualties. During the final equipment preparation phase, Specialist Park approached Natasha with concerns that reflected her growing awareness of discrepancies between her federal training background and the procedures being implemented for the emergency operation. Her questions suggested someone whose professional instincts had detected problems that more senior personnel were either missing or choosing to ignore due to operational pressures. Ms. Kellerman, some of the equipment configurations being used for this operation seem different from federal training standards that I encountered during my advanced education programs, Park observed, with careful diplomacy that avoided direct criticism while expressing legitimate technical concerns. Are there variations in tactical procedures that might affect operational outcomes during high-stress scenarios? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of professional awareness that Natasha had been hoping to encounter among personnel whose training backgrounds provided them with realistic baseline standards for comparison with academy procedures. Park's federal educational experience enabled her to recognize when operational techniques deviated from established best practices in potentially dangerous ways. Natasha recognized that Park's concerns provided an opportunity to begin raising awareness about systematic problems without directly challenging authority structures that would dismiss civilian criticism of tactical operations. Her response was designed to validate Park's professional instincts while encouraging further critical evaluation of procedures that differed from established federal guidelines. Specialist Park, tactical procedures can vary significantly between different training programs and operational environments, she replied with diplomatic neutrality that contained sufficient technical implications to confirm Park's suspicions. Federal guidelines sometimes emphasize different safety priorities than local training programs, particularly regarding equipment specifications and coordination protocols. The carefully phrased answer provided confirmation that Park's concerns were legitimate, while avoiding direct accusations that could be interpreted as inappropriate civilian interference in emergency law enforcement operations. However, the message was clear to someone with Park's educational background. The procedures being implemented contained elements that deviated from federal best practices in ways that created unnecessary operational risks. As the tactical teams completed their final preparations, Natasha faced the moment when her investigation would either remain academic documentation of training deficiencies or transform into active intervention to prevent the kind of preventable tragedy that had originally motivated her presence at the academy. The systematic problems she had identified were converging into operational conditions that could result in law enforcement casualties during an emergency operation that required flawless execution for successful resolution. The choice was clear but difficult. Maintain her civilian consultant cover and document whatever casualties resulted from training deficiencies, or reveal capabilities and knowledge that would shock everyone who had dismissed her expertise, while potentially preventing deaths that could be avoided through proper tactical procedures and equipment utilization. Agent Wells called for final operational briefings as deployment vehicles prepared to transport tactical teams to staging areas near the industrial complex, where armed fugitives waited in fortified positions that would test every aspect of law enforcement capabilities. The next few hours would determine whether months of advanced training had adequately prepared elite personnel for the kind of complex tactical challenges that distinguished routine police work from combat operations against military-level adversaries. As the briefing concluded and teams began moving toward their deployment vehicles, Natasha made the decision that would transform her role from passive observer to active participant in preventing the kind of systematic training failures that she had been documenting from claiming the lives of law enforcement personnel whose only mistake had been trusting training programs that contained hidden deficiencies. "Agent Wells," she said quietly, her voice carrying authority that hadn't been present during her previous civilian interactions, "I need to speak with you about tactical concerns that could affect operational outcomes." The simple statement marked the beginning of a transformation that would shock everyone who had dismissed her as a harmless civilian consultant, because Natasha Kellerman was about to reveal capabilities that would challenge everything they thought they understood about tactical operations and training excellence. Agent Wells turned toward Natasha with the polite but strained attention of someone managing a complex emergency operation while dealing with what appeared to be an interruption from a civilian consultant whose concerns might delay critical tactical deployments. Her expression carried the professional courtesy that federal law enforcement personnel maintained even under extreme stress, though her body language suggested someone whose patience was being tested by circumstances that required immediate action rather than additional consultation. "Ms. Kellerman, I appreciate any technical concerns you might have, but we're operating under time constraints that require immediate tactical deployment," Wells replied, with carefully controlled diplomacy that masked her growing frustration with what appeared to be academic interference in operational decision-making. "Perhaps your observations could be documented for post-operation review rather than delaying current tactical requirements." The response was entirely reasonable given the apparent hierarchy between federal operational command and civilian consulting roles, though it failed to account for the possibility that Natasha's concerns might be based on expertise that exceeded the qualifications of participating tactical personnel. Her next words would either establish credibility that commanded immediate attention or confirm her status as a well-meaning but inappropriate observer whose academic perspective lacked operational relevance. "Agent Wells, the tactical procedures being implemented for this operation contain systematic deficiencies that will likely result in law enforcement casualties during breach operations against prepared defensive positions," Natasha stated with quiet authority that cut through the operational chaos like a blade through silk. "I strongly recommend immediate review of explosive charge specifications, communication protocols, and entry sequence timing before deployment proceeds." The room fell completely silent as every person present processed the implications of what they had just heard. A civilian consultant was directly challenging the tactical competence of federal crisis response teams and regional SWAT commanders whose expertise had been proven through years of successful operations under dangerous conditions. The audacity of such a statement was breathtaking, particularly coming from someone whose appearance suggested academic background rather than operational experience. Captain Holbrook's reaction was immediate and explosive, his face reddening with the kind of rage that comes when carefully maintained professional facades are threatened by unexpected challenges to authority. His response carried the defensive aggression of someone whose career depended on maintaining credibility that was being directly questioned by what appeared to be inappropriate civilian interference. "Ms. Kellerman, you are completely out of line," Holbrook snapped with barely controlled fury that echoed through the command center with embarrassing intensity. "These tactical procedures represent the finest law enforcement training available in the United States, developed by professionals with decades of combat experience. Your civilian consulting credentials do not qualify you to question operational decisions made by federal agents and regional commanders." His outburst drew nods of agreement from several personnel who shared his outrage at what appeared to be academic arrogance interfering with emergency operations. The sentiment was completely understandable, as nothing about Natasha's appearance or documented background suggested the kind of tactical expertise that would justify challenging decisions made by elite law enforcement professionals. Detective Martinez stepped forward with the kind of protective loyalty that characterized elite tactical personnel when their professional competence was questioned by outsiders who lacked operational experience. Her intervention reflected both personal offense at the implied criticism and genuine concern about civilian interference that might compromise operational effectiveness. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is an active tactical operation involving armed suspects who have already demonstrated willingness to kill law enforcement personnel," Martinez said with restrained anger that reflected years of professional pride in tactical capabilities. "The techniques we're using have been proven effective during numerous successful operations, and second-guessing by civilian consultants puts lives at risk." The pushback was entirely predictable and completely justified based on the apparent credentials and authority relationships that defined the operational hierarchy. However, Natasha understood that preventing the casualties she anticipated would require establishing credibility that exceeded academic consulting qualifications, even if such revelation carried personal costs that she had been working to avoid. Agent Wells maintained professional composure while clearly struggling with the unprecedented situation of civilian interference in federal tactical operations. Her training included dealing with various forms of operational disruption, though none of her experience had prepared her for academic challenges to tactical procedures from someone whose background suggested no relevant operational experience. "Ms. Kellerman, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and allow operational personnel to proceed with tactical deployment," Wells stated with authority that left no doubt about the finality of her decision. "If you have documentation concerns, they can be addressed through proper channels after the immediate crisis has been resolved." The dismissal was reasonable and completely appropriate given the apparent circumstances, though it forced Natasha to choose between accepting marginalization that could result in preventable casualties or revealing capabilities that would fundamentally alter her relationship with everyone present. Her decision was made easier by the knowledge that the systematic training deficiencies she had documented were about to be tested under conditions that could prove fatal to law enforcement personnel whose only mistake was trusting inadequate preparation. Natasha reached into her messenger bag with deliberate slowness, her movements carefully controlled to avoid triggering defensive reactions from armed law enforcement personnel who might interpret sudden actions as potential threats. What she retrieved was a leather credential case that bore federal agency seals indicating security clearances and operational authorities that exceeded anything her civilian consultant documentation had suggested. "Agent Wells, before you proceed with tactical deployment, I recommend you verify my actual credentials rather than relying on the civilian consulting cover that brought me to this facility," Natasha said while extending identification that would transform everyone's understanding of her qualifications and authority. "My concerns about tactical procedures are based on operational experience that might be relevant to current circumstances." The federal identification that Agent Wells examined carried authorization levels that made her own credentials appear routine by comparison. Classification markings indicated involvement in operations that remained compartmentalized years after their completion, while agency affiliation suggested access to tactical training programs that exceeded anything available through conventional law enforcement channels. This identification indicates Department of Defense Special Operations Command with tactical authority designations that are classified above my clearance level, Wells said in a voice that had shifted from dismissive authority to confused deference. "Ms. Kellerman, these credentials suggest operational background that wasn't reflected in your consulting documentation." The transformation in Agent Wells's demeanor was immediate and profound as she processed the implications of authentic federal credentials that indicated expertise levels far exceeding her own operational experience. Her entire understanding of the consultation relationship had been fundamentally altered by documentation that revealed Natasha as someone whose tactical knowledge derived from classified operations rather than academic study. Sergeant Torres stared at the credentials with the expression of someone whose professional world was being restructured around completely new information. His years of tactical experience had taught him to recognize authentic federal documentation, and what he was seeing suggested that their civilian consultant possessed operational authority that exceeded everyone present in the command center. "Those are Special Activities Division credentials," Torres said in a whisper that carried across the silent command center like thunder. "That's the people who do operations that don't officially exist. What the hell is someone with that background doing observing our training program?" The question struck at the heart of everyone's confusion, as they struggled to understand why someone with elite federal tactical credentials would have been operating under civilian consultant cover while observing routine law enforcement training programs. The apparent contradictions suggested complexities that extended far beyond simple consulting arrangements or academic research projects. Captain Holbrook's defensive anger transformed into something approaching panic as he processed the implications of authentic federal credentials that indicated oversight authority exceeding his own command structure. His career had been built on maintaining training programs that operated with minimal external scrutiny, and the presence of special operations personnel suggested investigation levels that could expose aspects of his operation that wouldn't survive detailed examination. "Colonel Kellerman, if those credentials are authentic, then your presence here represents oversight that should have been coordinated through official channels," Holbrook stammered with the desperate diplomacy of someone whose carefully constructed professional image was collapsing around him. "My understanding was that you were providing routine technical consultation, not conducting operational assessment of training programs." The use of military rank reflected Holbrook's recognition that the situation had transformed from civilian consulting to potential federal investigation of his training operations. His defensive posture suggested someone whose hidden agendas were suddenly exposed to scrutiny from personnel whose authority exceeded his ability to influence or control. Natasha accepted the credential case that Agent Wells returned with hands that showed slight trembling as the federal agent processed the implications of having dismissed someone whose operational authority exceeded her own by several classification levels. The reversal of power dynamics was complete and irreversible, transforming Natasha from marginalized observer to commanding presence whose recommendations carried the weight of federal oversight authority. "Agent Wells, the tactical concerns I raised regarding explosive charge specifications and communication protocols are based on operational experience with similar scenarios in classified environments," Natasha explained with authority that had been completely absent during her previous civilian interactions. "The training deficiencies I've identified will likely result in casualties during the complex coordination requirements that successful resolution of this crisis will demand." Her transformation from dismissed consultant to recognized expert was so complete that several personnel had to remind themselves that this was the same person they had been ignoring throughout the emergency preparation process. The quiet confidence that had seemed inappropriate for civilian consulting now appeared entirely natural for someone whose background included operations that remained classified years after their completion. Detective Martinez approached Natasha with the professional respect that elite tactical personnel reserved for individuals whose credentials commanded immediate recognition. Her earlier defensive reaction had been replaced by genuine curiosity about the operational experience that supported such specific tactical concerns about procedures that she had considered routine and thoroughly tested. "Colonel Kellerman, could you elaborate on the specific deficiencies you've identified in our tactical procedures?" Martinez asked with the eager attention of someone whose professional development depended on learning from personnel with superior operational experience. "Your concerns about explosive charges and communication protocols suggest problems that we haven't recognized during our training preparation." The question represented exactly the kind of professional openness that Natasha had been hoping to encounter among the more experienced tactical personnel. Martinez's willingness to accept instruction from superior expertise demonstrated the adaptability that distinguished elite law enforcement officers from those whose careers stagnated due to inflexible adherence to familiar procedures. Natasha moved toward the tactical planning displays with fluid confidence that announced her familiarity with complex operational coordination requirements. Her analysis of the assault plans revealed understanding of tactical principles that exceeded the training backgrounds of everyone present, while her specific recommendations demonstrated expertise derived from successful operations under similar conditions. The primary deficiency involves explosive charge placement that creates structural stress patterns exceeding safety margins for multi-story industrial construction, she explained. While indicating positions on architectural drawings where modified charges would create unpredictable blast effects. The enhanced charges being prepared will likely cause partial building collapse that could trap assault teams inside debris fields while providing additional defensive cover for armed suspects. Her technical analysis was specific and detailed, reflecting understanding of structural engineering principles that complemented tactical expertise in ways that suggested comprehensive training in complex operations. The combination of architectural knowledge and explosive ordnance expertise represented educational background that exceeded conventional law enforcement preparation by significant margins. Additionally, the communication protocols being implemented contain coordination gaps that will create periods where teams cannot provide mutual support during critical breach phases. Natasha continued while reviewing radio procedures that appeared routine to personnel whose training hadn't included similar multi-team operations. The timing sequences specified for simultaneous entry will actually create windows where friendly fire incidents become statistically probable due to overlapping fields of fire and inadequate position identification procedures. Agent Wells listened with growing alarm as Natasha's analysis revealed systematic problems that federal operational planning had failed to identify despite comprehensive preparation by experienced crisis response personnel. The specific nature of her concerns suggested operational background that included actual experience with the kind of complex tactical scenarios that the current crisis demanded. Colonel Kellerman, are you suggesting that standard federal tactical procedures are inadequate for this operation? Wells asked with the careful neutrality of someone whose professional competence was being challenged by superior authority, while emergency time constraints demanded immediate decisions regarding operational modifications. The question reflected Wells's struggle to balance respect for higher credentials against confidence in training procedures that had been proven effective during previous operations. However, her willingness to consider alternative approaches demonstrated the professional flexibility that characterized elite federal personnel when confronted with expertise that exceeded their own experience levels. Natasha's response was designed to validate existing tactical competence while correcting specific deficiencies that could prove fatal during the unique circumstances that characterized the current operational environment. Her diplomatic approach reflected understanding that successful operations required cooperation rather than confrontation between personnel whose professional pride was being challenged by unexpected criticism. Agent Wells, federal tactical procedures represent excellent baseline standards for most operational scenarios, she replied with respect, that acknowledged existing competence while establishing authority for necessary modifications. However, the specific combination of structural complexity, suspect preparation time, and enhanced defensive capabilities requires adaptations that exceed conventional training parameters. Her assessment was technically accurate while diplomatically phrased to minimize professional offense among personnel whose expertise was being supplemented rather than replaced. The distinction was crucial for maintaining operational cooperation while implementing modifications that could prevent casualties during high-risk tactical scenarios. Instructor Garrison had remained silent during the credential verification process, his military background providing him with sufficient experience to recognize authentic special operations documentation when confronted with evidence that exceeded his ability to dispute. However, his defensive posture suggested someone whose carefully maintained training reputation was being challenged by expertise that revealed deficiencies in programs he had considered professionally adequate. Colonel Kellerman, the training procedures we've implemented represent current law enforcement best practices that have been proven effective during numerous successful operations, Garrison stated with diminished confidence that reflected his growing awareness that his tactical expertise might be inadequate for the operational challenges being discussed. Are you suggesting that our entire training curriculum contains systematic deficiencies that have somehow escaped detection by federal oversight programs? The question struck at the heart of his professional identity, while revealing his growing fear that months of training documentation might be exposed as inadequate preparation for elite tactical operations. His career depended on maintaining credibility regarding training programs that were being challenged by someone whose credentials suggested authority to implement immediate modifications or recommend comprehensive program restructuring. Natasha understood that Garrison's defensive reaction was entirely natural and professionally justified, though her investigation had revealed evidence of systematic problems that extended beyond simple training inadequacies to include corruption and deliberate safety violations that had been concealed through administrative manipulation. Instructor Garrison, training deficiencies aren't necessarily the result of inadequate professional competence, she replied with diplomatic neutrality that avoided direct accusations while establishing foundation for more serious revelations that would follow. However, my investigation has identified systematic modifications to federal training standards that appear to serve interests other than optimal tactical preparation for participating personnel. Her carefully phrased response suggested awareness of administrative irregularities while avoiding direct accusations that could trigger defensive reactions that might interfere with immediate operational requirements. However, the implications were clear to anyone familiar with institutional corruption patterns that compromised training quality while benefiting individuals whose interests didn't align with officer safety or operational effectiveness. Captain Holbrook's expression shifted from defensive anger to something approaching desperation, as he processed the implications of federal investigation authority being applied to training programs that he knew contained irregularities that wouldn't survive detailed scrutiny. His financial arrangements with private contractors and equipment modifications that exceeded safety specifications represented exactly the kinds of corruption that Special Operations Oversight was designed to identify and eliminate. Colonel Kellerman, I want to assure you that any administrative irregularities in our training programs are the result of resource constraints and operational pressures, rather than deliberate violations of federal standards, Holbrook said with the panicked diplomacy of someone whose career was collapsing in real time. I'm completely prepared to cooperate with any investigation that might be necessary to address concerns about training procedures or administrative compliance. His immediate offer of cooperation confirmed Natasha's suspicions about deliberate corruption while providing foundation for post-operation investigation that would address systematic problems beyond the immediate tactical crisis. However, her primary concern remained preventing casualties during the current operation rather than pursuing accountability for training deficiencies that could be addressed after armed fugitives had been neutralized. The tactical modifications that Natasha recommended required immediate implementation if they were to prevent casualties during operations that couldn't be delayed without enabling suspect escape or additional threat to public safety. Her expertise would be tested under conditions that left no margin for theoretical knowledge that hadn't been proven through actual operational experience. Agent Wells, I recommend immediate substitution of standard explosive charges for the modified devices currently prepared for breach operations, Natasha explained while reviewing equipment specifications that she recognized as dangerously inadequate for structural applications. Additionally, communication protocols should be modified to include positive identification requirements and coordinated timing sequences that prevent friendly fire incidents during simultaneous entry phases. Her recommendations were specific and technically detailed, reflecting understanding of tactical principles that could only be acquired through successful operations under similar conditions. The confidence with which she proposed modifications suggested someone whose expertise had been proven through experience rather than acquired through academic study or routine training programs. Agent Wells faced the unprecedented decision of modifying federal tactical operations based on recommendations from personnel whose credentials exceeded her own authority, while time constraints demanded immediate action regarding procedures that had been considered adequate during previous crisis responses. Her choice would either validate superior expertise or compromise operational effectiveness through unnecessary modifications to proven techniques. Colonel Kellerman, implementing the modifications you've recommended will delay deployment by at least 2 hours while equipment is reconfigured and personnel receive additional briefings, Wells observed with obvious concern about time constraints that could enable suspect escape or additional preparation that might make the facility impregnable against conventional assault techniques. Are you confident that these changes are necessary to prevent casualties during tactical operations? The question required Natasha to stake her reputation and credibility on tactical judgments that would be tested under conditions where mistakes could cost lives among the law enforcement personnel whose safety she was trying to protect. Her answer would either establish her authority definitively or expose her recommendations as theoretical concerns that lacked practical foundation. Agent Wells, implementing these modifications will prevent casualties that are statistically certain to occur if current procedures are used against prepared defensive positions, Natasha replied with absolute conviction that reflected experience gained through operations where similar tactical decisions had determined outcomes between mission success and catastrophic failure. The delay represents acceptable risk compared to casualties that can be prevented through proper tactical preparation. Her commitment was complete and irreversible, transforming her from consultant to operational authority whose expertise would be validated or refuted through results that couldn't be disputed or explained away through academic theories. The next few hours would prove whether her tactical knowledge derived from genuine operational experience or represented academic overconfidence that exceeded actual capabilities. As equipment modifications began and personnel received updated tactical briefings, Natasha prepared to demonstrate breach techniques that she claimed would succeed where conventional procedures would fail. Her credibility would be established through performance that exceeded the capabilities of elite tactical personnel, whose professional competence had been proven through years of successful operations. The real test of her expertise was about to begin under conditions where failure would cost lives that she had promised to protect through tactical knowledge that exceeded conventional training standards. Everything she had claimed about her background and capabilities would be proven or disproven through operational results that left no room for theoretical explanations or academic excuses. The modified tactical operation launched at precisely 1400 hours with equipment configurations and coordination protocols that represented complete departure from standard federal procedures. Agent Wells had made the difficult decision to implement Natasha's recommendations despite unprecedented circumstances that required trusting tactical modifications proposed by someone whose operational background remained largely classified. The stakes couldn't have been higher. 3 armed fugitives with military training had fortified an industrial complex using sophisticated defensive preparations that challenged conventional assault techniques. Natasha rode in the lead tactical vehicle wearing borrowed protective gear that transformed her appearance from academic consultant to operational commander, whose presence announced serious federal involvement in what had become the largest law enforcement operation in Arizona's recent history. Her radio call sign identified her as Breach Advisory Control, a designation that reflected her unique role in coordinating tactical modifications that could determine operational success or failure. The industrial complex loomed against the desert horizon like a fortress designed to resist exactly the kind of assault that federal tactical teams were preparing to execute. Intelligence reports confirmed that the fugitives had used their 12-hour head start to establish overlapping fields of fire, improvised explosive devices, and communication intercept capabilities that would challenge even the most experienced special operations personnel. Team Alpha assembled at their primary assault position, with equipment that reflected Natasha's specific modifications to standard breach procedures. Detective Martinez examined the reconfigured explosive charges with obvious curiosity about techniques that exceeded her extensive tactical training, while her team members prepared specialized entry equipment that none of them had encountered during conventional law enforcement operations. Breach Advisory Control Team Alpha is in position and ready for coordinated assault initiation, Martinez reported through communication protocols that included positive identification requirements and timing sequences designed to prevent friendly fire incidents during simultaneous operations. Equipment configuration is complete according to your specifications. The professional respect in Martinez's voice reflected her growing understanding that their civilian consultant possessed tactical expertise that exceeded her own operational experience. Her willingness to adapt proven techniques based on superior knowledge demonstrated the professional flexibility that distinguished elite law enforcement personnel from those whose careers stagnated due to inflexible adherence to familiar procedures. Team Bravo reached their secondary breach position with similar equipment modifications that represented significant departures from training procedures that Sergeant Torres had considered thoroughly tested and professionally adequate. His radio communications reflected careful attention to coordination requirements that exceeded normal tactical operations, while maintaining confidence in capabilities that had been proven through years of successful missions. Breach Advisory Control Team Bravo confirms readiness for simultaneous breach operations with modified timing sequences and enhanced communication protocols, Torres announced while reviewing approach routes that would require split-second coordination between units operating without visual contact. Teams are prepared for immediate execution upon your authorization. The formal communication structure reflected recognition that Natasha's tactical authority exceeded conventional command relationships, while acknowledging her responsibility for coordinating modifications that could prevent casualties or compromise mission effectiveness. Her recommendations would be tested under conditions that left no margin for theoretical knowledge that hadn't been proven through actual operational experience. Federal surveillance teams reported suspect movements that confirmed intelligence assessments regarding defensive preparations designed to maximize casualties among responding tactical personnel. Hidden camera feeds revealed improvised barriers, weapon emplacements, and explosive devices positioned to create overlapping kill zones that would challenge conventional assault techniques while providing multiple escape routes for fugitives who understood law enforcement operational procedures. All teams, Intelligence confirms that suspects have established prepared defensive positions with military-level sophistication. Agent Wells announced through command frequencies that reached every participating unit. Breach Advisory Control has tactical authority for coordination modifications that represent our best opportunity for successful resolution without law enforcement casualties. The formal acknowledgement of Natasha's operational authority represented unprecedented delegation of federal tactical command to someone whose background remained compartmentalized beyond normal security clearances. However, the gravity of the situation required utilizing every available advantage against adversaries whose preparation time and military training created exceptional challenges for conventional law enforcement responses. Natasha monitored multiple communication channels while reviewing real-time intelligence that confirmed her tactical assessment regarding the inadequacy of standard procedures against prepared defensive positions. The structural analysis she had conducted revealed load-bearing vulnerabilities that could be exploited through precise explosive placement, while suspect positioning created opportunities for tactical deception that exceeded conventional training parameters. All teams initiate modified breach sequence on my mark, Natasha announced with authority that reflected years of experience coordinating complex operations under similar conditions. Timing is critical for preventing defensive concentration while maintaining friendly fire safety margins. Execute in 5, 4, 3, 2, mark. The coordinated assault began with explosive charges that produced precisely calibrated structural effects rather than the overwhelming force that characterized standard law enforcement procedures. Natasha's modifications created multiple entry points simultaneously, while avoiding blast pressures that could have caused building collapse or created debris fields that trapped assault personnel in vulnerable positions. Team Alpha's breach created a perfectly sized opening that allowed rapid entry without exposing personnel to defensive fire from prepared positions, while the structural effects were confined to load-bearing modifications that eliminated suspect cover without compromising building integrity. Martinez led her team through the entry point with flawless coordination that reflected enhanced communication protocols designed to prevent coordination failures during high-stress tactical situations. Breach Advisory Control, Team Alpha has achieved successful entry with 0 casualties and optimal tactical positioning, Martinez reported while her team secured their assigned sector using techniques that exceeded her previous operational experience. Structural effects were precisely as predicted, and suspect defensive positions have been neutralized without collateral damage to building infrastructure. The successful breach validation represented proof that Natasha's tactical expertise derived from operational experience rather than theoretical knowledge, while her specific predictions about structural effects and defensive positioning demonstrated understanding that could only be acquired through similar operations under actual combat conditions. Team Bravo executed their coordinated breach with identical precision, creating entry opportunities that eliminated suspect advantages while maintaining tactical surprise that prevented organized resistance. Torres's team flowed through their breach point, using movement techniques that reflected enhanced training and coordination procedures that exceeded standard law enforcement preparation. Breach Advisory Control, Team Bravo confirmed successful breach with complete neutralization of defensive positions in assigned sector, Torres announced while his team secured fugitives whose sophisticated preparations had been rendered ineffective through tactical modifications that exceeded their operational planning. Suspects are in custody with 0 casualties among law enforcement personnel. The flawless execution of modified tactical procedures represented vindication of Natasha's controversial recommendations while proving that her expertise exceeded the qualifications of federal crisis response teams whose previous training had been considered adequate for any conceivable law enforcement scenario. Agent Wells coordinated post-operation procedures with obvious relief that her decision to implement unprecedented tactical modifications had resulted in mission success without casualties that could have compromised her career and reputation. Her communication with higher headquarters emphasized the exceptional circumstances that had required utilizing special operations expertise for resolution of what had become a federal crisis. Federal Command Operation Desert Shield has concluded with complete success and 0 law enforcement casualties, Wells reported while coordinating prisoner transport and evidence collection that would support prosecution of suspects whose escape had threatened public safety throughout the southwestern United States. Resolution was achieved through tactical modifications that exceeded standard federal procedures but proved essential for mission success. The official acknowledgement of tactical innovation represented recognition that conventional law enforcement procedures had been inadequate for the specific challenges presented by military-trained adversaries using sophisticated defensive preparations against elite federal tactical teams. As post-operation debriefings commenced, the true scope of Natasha's investigation began to emerge through evidence that she had been systematically gathering regarding training corruption and safety violations that extended far beyond the Phoenix Metropolitan Police Training Academy. Her documentation revealed patterns of procurement fraud, equipment modification, and procedural shortcuts that had been concealed through administrative manipulation while increasing risks to law enforcement personnel throughout the region. Captain Holbrook's arrest proceeded with military efficiency as federal investigators secured evidence that confirmed systematic violations of training standards designed to maximize performance metrics while minimizing costs through dangerous shortcuts that had already resulted in preventable casualties. His financial arrangements with private contractors represented textbook examples of corruption that compromised officer safety while enriching individuals whose interests conflicted with legitimate training objectives. Colonel Kellerman, the evidence you've provided documents corruption patterns that extend throughout multiple training facilities and procurement networks, announced Special Agent Richardson from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit as investigators processed documentation that would support federal prosecutions involving dozens of personnel across several states. Your investigation has prevented additional casualties while exposing systematic problems that threatened law enforcement personnel throughout the Southwest. The scope of corruption that Natasha had uncovered exceeded initial expectations while revealing coordination between multiple agencies and private contractors, whose profit margins depended on cutting safety corners that increased risks to tactical personnel whose lives depended on proper equipment and training procedures. Instructor Garrison's cooperation with federal investigators reflected his growing understanding that his training deficiencies had been exploited by corruption networks that used legitimate educational programs as cover for procurement fraud and equipment modification schemes that served private interests rather than law enforcement requirements. His detailed testimony provided crucial evidence for prosecutions that would eliminate systemic problems while protecting future training participants from similar exploitation. I thought the equipment modifications were legitimate cost-saving measures that maintained training effectiveness while reducing departmental expenses, Garrison explained to investigators whose understanding of tactical training enabled them to recognize violations that civilian prosecutors might overlook. Colonel Kellerman's analysis revealed safety implications that I wasn't qualified to identify despite years of training experience. His admission of inadequate technical knowledge regarding explosive ordnance and structural engineering reflected honest acknowledgement of limitations that corruption networks had exploited while maintaining plausible deniability regarding safety violations that resulted from modified procedures and equipment specifications. Detective Martinez approached Natasha during post-operation debriefings with professional curiosity about operational background that remained largely classified despite demonstration of capabilities that exceeded conventional special operations training. Her questions reflected genuine interest in career development opportunities that might provide access to training programs that produced such exceptional tactical expertise. Colonel Kellerman, the breach techniques you demonstrated today exceeded anything in current law enforcement training curricula, Martinez observed with obvious admiration for capabilities that had enabled mission success under conditions that challenged elite federal tactical teams. Are there educational opportunities that might provide access to similar operational training for personnel with appropriate security clearances? The question demonstrated exactly the kind of professional development attitude that characterized law enforcement personnel whose careers advanced through continuous learning and adaptation to evolving operational requirements. However, Natasha's background involved classified programs that remained restricted years after their completion due to national security implications that exceeded conventional law enforcement applications. Detective Martinez, the techniques demonstrated today represent adaptations of classified procedures that aren't available through conventional training programs. Natasha replied with diplomatic neutrality that acknowledged interest while protecting operational security requirements that prevented detailed discussion of specific methods or educational backgrounds. However, federal agencies offer advanced training opportunities that provide enhanced capabilities for personnel with exceptional qualifications and security clearances. Her response provided encouragement for continued professional development while maintaining appropriate classification boundaries that protected methods and capabilities that remained restricted despite successful demonstration under emergency conditions. Specialist Park joined the conversation with questions that reflected her growing understanding of federal training standards that exceeded academy procedures in ways that enhanced both safety and operational effectiveness. Her educational background provided foundation for recognizing systematic differences between programs designed for different operational environments and security requirements. Colonel Kellerman, the coordination protocols you implemented today seem specifically designed to address communication gaps that I've noticed during previous training exercises. Park observed with professional insight that demonstrated learning capacity that exceeded her current assignment parameters. Are these modifications that could be incorporated into standard training programs without compromising operational security? The question revealed understanding of institutional change processes that could address systematic problems through educational reform rather than individual correction of specific deficiencies. Her perspective suggested potential for career advancement that would enable implementation of improvements that protected personnel throughout law enforcement organizations. Natasha recognized Park's potential for contributing to training reform initiatives that could prevent repetition of corruption and safety violations that had been exposed through her investigation. The young officer's combination of technical competence and institutional awareness represented exactly the kind of leadership capability that law enforcement organizations required for adapting to evolving operational challenges. Specialist Park, many of the safety protocols demonstrated today represent standard procedures that could be implemented through enhanced training programs without compromising operational security, she replied, while considering recruitment possibilities that could support ongoing reform initiatives. Federal agencies are always seeking personnel with appropriate qualifications for advanced training programs that address complex operational requirements. The conversation reflected growing recognition among participating personnel that their civilian consultant possessed capabilities that exceeded their previous understanding of tactical expertise, while representing career opportunities that might not otherwise become available through conventional advancement pathways. Agent Wells coordinated final operational reports with acknowledgement that federal tactical procedures had been enhanced through expertise that exceeded conventional training parameters, while establishing precedents for incorporating special operations knowledge into crisis response capabilities that might be required for future emergency situations. Colonel Kellerman, your tactical modifications enabled mission success under conditions that would have challenged standard federal procedures. Wells stated with professional respect that reflected her growing understanding of operational expertise that exceeded her own qualifications despite years of crisis response experience. Would you consider providing consultation for enhanced training programs that incorporate these techniques into federal tactical curricula? The offer represented recognition that Natasha's demonstrated capabilities could benefit federal law enforcement organizations whose operational requirements increasingly demanded expertise that exceeded conventional training standards while maintaining appropriate classification boundaries that protected national security interests. The comprehensive reform initiatives that resulted from Natasha's investigation transformed law enforcement training throughout the southwestern United States, while establishing accountability measures that prevented repetition of corruption patterns that had endangered personnel through systematic safety violations. Federal oversight programs implemented enhanced monitoring that protected training integrity, while ensuring that educational investments produced genuine capability improvements rather than performance metrics that concealed dangerous shortcuts. 3 months after the successful resolution of the fugitive crisis, Captain Holbrook received a federal sentence of 12 years for conspiracy to defraud government training programs while endangering law enforcement personnel through equipment modifications and procedural shortcuts that violated basic safety standards. His conviction represented the first in a series of prosecutions that eliminated corruption networks throughout multiple states, while establishing legal precedents that protected training program integrity. The civil settlements that followed provided compensation for families of officers who had been killed or injured through preventable training accidents that resulted from systematic safety violations that had been concealed through administrative manipulation. While financial compensation couldn't restore lost lives, the accountability measures that accompanied legal resolution ensured that similar tragedies would be prevented through enhanced oversight and safety protocols. Natasha returned to her civilian life carrying satisfaction that her investigation had prevented additional casualties while exposing corruption that threatened law enforcement personnel throughout an entire region. Her cover identity as a consulting academic remained intact for operational security purposes, though her demonstrated capabilities had established relationships within federal law enforcement that would continue supporting reform initiatives for years to come. The memorial service for Detective Kevin Kellerman, Natasha's husband who had been killed during a training accident 18 months earlier, could finally include acknowledgement of the systematic changes that his death had ultimately inspired. Her investigation had been motivated by determination to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses through preventable accidents that resulted from corruption and negligence rather than inherent operational dangers. The advanced tactical training programs that were subsequently implemented throughout federal law enforcement incorporated safety protocols and technical procedures that reflected lessons learned from Natasha's investigation, while maintaining operational effectiveness that exceeded previous capabilities. Her contributions to law enforcement training would protect personnel for generations while ensuring that technical innovation served officer safety rather than private profit margins. Years later, when law enforcement personnel encountered complex tactical scenarios that required enhanced capabilities, their instructors would reference the Phoenix operation as demonstration that expertise transcends conventional boundaries when lives depend on getting procedures exactly right. The legend of the civilian consultant who revolutionized tactical training would inspire future generations to recognize competence, regardless of its apparent source, while maintaining standards that protected personnel through genuine expertise rather than impressive credentials that concealed inadequate preparation. The industrial complex where armed fugitives had been captured through tactical innovations that exceeded federal training standards was eventually converted into a law enforcement training facility that incorporated enhanced safety protocols and technical procedures developed through Natasha's expertise. The Desert Shield Training Center became a model for educational programs that combined operational realism with safety standards that protected personnel while preparing them for the most challenging tactical scenarios they might encounter during their careers. Natasha's transformation from dismissed civilian consultant to legendary tactical expert proved that assumptions about capability based on appearance or conventional credentials could prevent recognition of expertise that might prove crucial during emergency situations. Her demonstration that technical competence could emerge from unexpected sources while serving purposes beyond immediate recognition established principles that enhanced law enforcement effectiveness throughout an entire generation of tactical personnel, whose safety depended on learning from superior knowledge regardless of its apparent origins. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.